friends, colleagues of the Elcano Royal Institute for International and Strategic Studies, and to the world at large. I'm Paul Isbell, Senior Associate Fellow at the Real Instituto Elcano. We have as our guest today another colleague of the House, Sebastian Royo, Professor of Political Science at Suffolk University in Massachusetts, the United States of America. We're very happy to have you here. We're going to discuss the phenomenon of the recent elections in the United States, some of the sources for the outcome, as well as what to expect. Welcome, Sebastian.
A pleasure to be here, Paul.
First question I want to ask, given that you're a political scientist, but with a strong command of economics and social tendencies, would you see Donald Trump as a victorious candidate as something of a black swan? Mm-hmm. And by that I mean what is perceived as a low probability but high impact event?
Mm-hmm. There is no question that there are elements of this election that can be interpreted as a black swan. In some ways, it should be less of a surprise that maybe some people perceive it to be. When you look at the economic realities of the country, when you see the mobilization of the white working class in response to the failure of the economic policies of the previous decades, when you see the discontent against the establishment, against the traditional institutions, against Washington, it is not surprising that this has happened. But it was not anticipated either, because historically, those were voters that tended to vote Democrat, not Republican, and also because the profile of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate is very unusual. The larger question is whether or not it will have high impact. And that remains to be seen. In some ways, there are elements of his campaign and his own personal views that are unique. We clearly have an individual here with very few, if any, ideological attachments. In many ways, he's not a traditional conservative. He's an activist, pro-government politician. His slogan has been magisterial. The Make America Great Again has been able to capture the imagination of millions of voters and mobilize them, and they have supported and voted for him. At the same time, it's not clear what that means. Because what exactly is he going to do to make America great again? It's a combination here of some traditional liberal policies like investment in infrastructure with more untraditional one, like the opposition to free trade, which has been a tenet that both Democrats and Republicans have been supporting over the last few decades. And it's also someone that it clearly is very pragmatic and has a tremendous flexibility in terms of making decisions and changing his mind. So what does it mean in terms of the long term with the policy that he will implement? I think part of what we have to understand that this is a person that operates based on his personal experience, his background, with a very short-term focus.
Well, it's interesting that you you mentioned that it should have been foreseen, or it shouldn't have been that surprising. That's actually a hallmark after the fact of identifying the so-called black swan event. On the high impact side of that equation, right, which you question, because I guess what I'm reading out of you is that the horizon's unclear, given the very unique characteristics of this president-elect historically, and the uniqueness of the historical moment globally. Correct. So what I wanted to ask, to me, if I look for an area where there might be high impact and where we might even be able to see that no matter which way the impact spins, that it will be significant, is in the realm of the institutions of the global order, which the United States, for the last at least 60 to 70 years, have been pushing to construct with varying degrees of intensity, and at least looking to defend, again, with varying degrees of intensity. But it appears now that all of the energy and momentum that this global system of institutions representing the liberal democratic global order, does seem to be marginalized, at least in terms of the focus of people around the world.
No question. I think that there are two sides to that question. On the one hand is the personal characteristic of Donald Trump and his own personal preferences in the way that he works. This is not a person that is an institutionalist, that works through institutions. This is a person that is an individualist, that works through individuals. So you can foresee a situation in which, when he's operating in the global arena, it's going to be more in the realm of individual relationship, individual negotiation, rather than working through traditional institutions. And I think that's because that's the way that, more often than not, business people tend to operate. So I think that we can expect that. And that can bring what you were talking about, which in some ways a marginalization of those institutions. And that will be compounded by the second issue that I will reflect on, which is probably the perception of those institutions as part of the problem, as being irrelevant in the new context of the world, both from a geopolitical and economic standpoint. The belief that those institutions, we just don't need them anymore, they haven't worked, they're part of the problem. His almost contempt for NATO, an example of that. They haven't worked, they don't have a function anymore. Why do we need to work through those institutions? So I think the combination of probably that worldview, that interpretation of the institution, plus his own personal business background that, again, will be more individual, it probably will lead it to a situation along the lines of what you described, that we can see more irrelevance of these institutions moving forward.
Well, one last question, and going back to some of the factors which have led to this election result and the new horizon that we have. What would you say actually happened? You mentioned that the white working classes, particularly in the so-called red states or Republican states, led something of a last-minute rebellion at the margin. But in previous conversations here in the Elcano, where our director has pointed out that you're one of the few people that have been through the Elcano before the election to point out the actual real possibility of Trump winning the election. You have claimed to have seen this coming for a long time, and I think for those that have some kind of critical distance on relations in the United States can see it. But many people in the camp of the Democrats in the cities and on the coast were very surprised. Do you think that being a foreigner in the United States, well integrated for so many years, if you've been there a quarter of a century, but still, you know, with a foot outside the country, do you think this has given you a critical distance, which helps see, if not, you know, see out of a bubble, see both of the bubbles, or these kinds of perceptual bubbles that seem to have had a role in the evolution of this election?
Yeah. I think it's been unquestionably helpful at two levels. One is it gives me a comparative perspective, that I can look at issues based on other experiences, other information that I have from other countries, from other situations. And at the same time, it has given me the opportunity of probably seeing things that are invisible for the locals, the ones that they're so used to it, they have accepted, they have internalized in ways in which it probably is not so relevant, it's not so distinctive to them. And one of the things that I have value is in my trips, in my conversations throughout parts of the US, to me, is new territory. I mean, these are things that I haven't seen before. These are people that I have not encountered before. And when I do it, it opened my eyes to a reality that is foreign to me. Sometimes you almost feel like you are in a different country. I live in Boston. Boston is a bastion of liberalism for the US. And then you can easily make the assumption that the rest of the country is like that. And then you just travel for an hour, 2 hours. You get into New Hampshire. You get into the more rural areas of Maine, Vermont. You travel to the south, to Pennsylvania. You go to upstate New York. And in all the time that I have done that, and sometimes during the last year, during the election, it has been striking to see how different it felt, how different it was. And something that I have perceived, two things that have been profoundly striking. One was unquestionably the poverty and the pain, which I had not quite visualized so clearly prior to this election. And the other, unquestionably, has been the anger. Clearly, it's been festering there in a way in which it has finally come up to the surface in this election. This election has been, in many ways, a reaction to that anger.
To conclude, and I'm interested to see, what the angle is for you, given your unique situation in the United States. If there was one thing now with the new horizon that would raise concern in you with respect to the future of the United States, I'm curious just what that would be. And on the other hand, if there's something that gives you some kind of reason for enthusiasm or reason to believe, what would it be?
Yeah. And a few reflections. I mean, one is the anger in many ways is justified. I think part of the problem that we are now coming to grips with is with the realization that the economic reality for those people that now have voted for Trump was extraordinarily problematic, and that had to be addressed, and that the policies that we've been implemented over the last 2 decades have failed those people, and that we need to do something about it. So that's I think, it's an important reflection, and particularly for the Democratic Party. I think somehow they underestimated the degree of pain, the degree of anger, and that led them to ignoring it, with the consequences that we have seen in this election. And the Republican Party has capitalized on that situation. But the thing that worries me the most looking forward is clearly the polarization of the country, Paul. You see a degree of anger, fear, aggravation like I've never seen before in my years in the US. Now, granted, I wasn't there in the 1960s when probably there was a level of confrontation that may be comparable to what we see now. But
only without the amplifying effects of social media and the rest of the technological platforms that have developed in the last 50
That has
years.
made it extraordinarily more difficult because we don't have filters. Everyone now
And the timing is much more rapid.
Correct.
The short-termism that used to be just part of the horizon of the corporate world seems to invade public discourse.
Absolutely. So in that context, this polarization, how is it going to impact our ability to build consensus, to rebuild the community that clearly has been fractured over the last few decades, to rebuild the notion of the American dream as a reality in which anyone, regardless of their creed, their economic situation, their last name, the geographical place in which they're born, that if you work hard, if you do the right thing, then anything is possible. That has been in many ways one of the most defining aspects of American culture and American political culture. And now with the economic situation and with this degree of polarization, how can we do that? On the positives, and connected to that, of course, is the discredit of the elites, the establishment, and even more important, at least from a personal standpoint, of institutions. I mean, I think institutions are crucial for the functioning of countries and democracy. And we're living in a moment in history throughout the world, not just in the US, in which we're seeing extraordinary discredit and erosion of institutions. On the positive side, I have to say that in the midst of all this polarization and anger that are very worrisome, I have seen a degree of mobilization on the part of young people, college students in general, that I have never seen before in all my years in the US. They feel now passionate about politics. They want to do something. They want to mobilize. They want to participate, to be active. And that's in a segment of the population that historically, or at least for the last few decades, they have been quite passive. They don't vote. They don't feel elections matter. They don't feel that whether it's a Democrat or a Republican that wins, it makes any difference to their life and the prospect of life. I think this outcome of this election has really brought home that elections matter, that who is in power can impact your life, can impact your future. And I have seen a reaction there that it has been extraordinarily inspiring.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sebastian. Sebastian Royo, our guest today at the Elcano Royal Institute. We'll continue this discussion. It's certainly an interesting historical moment, and we'll be back with you soon. Thank you
very much. I really appreciate it.